This is topic 2.7, Ecological Succession, from the course and exam description for AP Environmental Science. Pay attention to your learning goals. Up here, the first one, ERT-2.1, I can describe ecological succession, comes from the course and exam description published by the College Board. The second one comes from the textbook listed below, and it's more specific. Okay, so when we've got changes in our ecosystems, terrestrial means land, so changes in land ecosystem, it's called succession, ecological succession. And it is a predictable pattern that we'll learn in a second. You need to know the difference between primary succession and secondary. They do not follow each other. So this is a misconception that students have in their heads a lot about succession, and they think that primary happens first, then secondary. No. They are completely separate processes. They don't follow each other. Okay, primary succession is when something happens and you have bare rock, no soil to begin with. The first things that come into those bare rocks, whether it's a volcano that erupts and it solidifies into solid rock, or a glacier melts and retreats and leaves behind solid rock, the first thing that happens is you have pioneer species. Our pioneer species tend to be lichens, mosses. Think lichens. I know it says algae first, but on the AP test you want to know lichens first and mosses, so lichens and mosses. At the end of succession, we have a climax community. So let's take a look at our picture here. So the first picture here is lichens, and lichens are here growing on a tree, but lichens actually grow on rocks too. And then mosses can grow on rocks where it's damp. So lichens can grow in drier conditions. I've seen them out in the desert. And mosses can grow on shadier, moister conditions. And they eventually die, and they decompose, and they build up the soil. So you can see here we have exposed rocks. Then lichen and mosses come in. They die, decompose, and they start to build soil through their decomposition. And then some seeds blow in, and you get your annual wildflowers from those seeds that blow in. And then other seeds, like for grasses, come in, and then shrubs. So we've got to build soil. So these wildflowers and the grasses die, decompose, start to build up soil, and eventually there's enough soil for the shrubs to grow. They die, decompose, then there's enough soil for your trees, your smaller trees, and then your bigger trees. And so it can take several hundred years for this process to occur. All right, so we also have secondary succession, and secondary happens when there's something that occurs, like a massive flood that wipes out all the plants but leaves the soil, or fire that burns down the plants but leaves the soil, or a farmer decides they don't want to farm anymore and they let their field go back to nature, so there's still soil. So anytime you have soil, you start with secondary succession. So the first things that grow are your wildflowers, then your grasses, then your shrubs, then your small trees, then your big trees. So it's similar, but not the same thing, and it doesn't follow primary. That's a big thing to keep straight in your head. Okay, aquatic ecosystems can go through succession as well. I'll show you what this looks like, but in aquatic succession, you have little changes that lead to bigger changes over many, many years, like in a tide pool, which we call the rocky intertidal shore. If they get big waves, a big storm comes through and turns over some rocks, different things can happen. You don't really have to know that for your test and how that works in the ocean. For ponds, what happens is that the aquatic plants, now this is really, this is ponds and small lakes, not big lakes, not big bodies of water. But in ponds and small lakes, those water plants will die and they'll settle to the bottom and eventually fill up the whole pond. And so that can happen in ponds. You can see that by this picture. Okay, you need to know that succession begins. When it begins, you're going to increase your species richness, your biomass, your productivity. As there are a few species to begin with, your resources start off high, they're not really being used, you have lots of nutrients, etc. As more species show up, your biomass, your productivity increases. However, after a little while, those resources get used up, the nutrients in the soil get used up, and so you have a drop in biomass and productivity over time. And this is a little graph that, a series of graphs that kind of show you this process. So the first graph is species richness over time, then biomass, and then productivity. So you can see with secondary succession that it peaks here at about 40 years, the productivity, and then it declines. You can see here that richness peaks at about 90 years, and then it declines a little. And then biomass kind of just goes up and down a little bit. You on the AP test and my test, you need to be able to read and interpret a graph. You don't have to memorize this information, but if you're given these graphs, you need to be able to read and answer questions about them. Okay, let's talk about keystone species. So keystone species have a disproportional large impact on a community. Beavers are an example. Sea otters are a big example as well. When you remove sea otters from the kelp forest, then the kelp forest disappears because the sea otters eat the urchins and urchins eat the kelp. And if there's no sea otters eating urchins, the urchins are going to overpopulate and eat the kelp, and there's no kelp forest. So without the sea otters, no kelp forest. All right, let's talk about beavers on the next page. So the reason why beavers are considered a keystone species is because of the beaver dams. And inside of a beaver dam made out of all these sticks, so you can see kind of one in the background, usually it dams in the middle of a river or a pond or a lake. And inside of those twigs is called a beaver lodge. But the beavers live there, but so do like fish and crustaceans and a whole bunch of other things. So it increases your biodiversity. And it makes your whole ecosystem, your riparian ecosystem. Riparian means like rivers or wetlands are having to do with fresh water. So freshwater riparian ecosystems are healthier with beavers and beaver dams. Okay, another one is sea stars. So sea stars are predators of mussels. And so they keep the mussel population from exploding and kind of taking over. So sea stars will regulate those populations, and they are considered a keystone species in the intertidal zone. The next type of species you need to know are indicator species, and they will indicate if there's a problem in an ecosystem. So when they disappear, it means there's some sort of pollution or climate change or something happening. Lichen is one. They're very sensitive to air pollution. Amphibians, frogs, salamanders are in deep trouble worldwide, and we think it's due to all the pollution. And then larval mayflies, you'll study in Unit 8, water quality, and our bugs, we call them macroinvertebrate bugs, will help us understand the pollution level in a body of water, fresh water, by their presence or absence. All right, that's it for 2.7.